The A.K. Gopalan versus State of Madras case, heard by the Indian Supreme Court in 1950, stands as a foundational case in the realm of preventive detention laws in India. It primarily dealt with the Preventive Detention Act of 1950, which allowed the governments to detain the individuals suspected of posing a threat to national security or public order without providing them a trial or the chance to challenge their detention in the court. A.K. Gopalan, a communist leader, was detained under this act and challenged the constitutionality of the law. This case came up for hearing in the Supreme Court. A six-judge constitutional bench was constituted, comprising of Chief Justice H.J. Kania, Justice M. Patanjali Shastri, Justice Meher Chand Mahajan, Justice B.K. Mukherjee, Justice Sudhir Ranjan Das, and Justice Syed Faisal Ali. Now, we come to the facts of the case. A.K. Gopalan was an influential communist leader. He was detained in 1947 and continued to be detained under the Preventive Detention Act 1950, which was enacted by the Madras government on March 1, 1950. Gopalan had been detained without trial, and the detention order was issued under Section 3, subsection 1 of the Act. Gopalan challenged the detention by filing a petition under Article 32 of the Indian Constitution seeking relief from unlawful detention. He contended that the detention violated his fundamental rights under Article 14, 19, and 21 of the Constitution. Furthermore, Gopalan argued that the principle of natural justice was not followed, as he was not given a fair hearing or informed of the reasons for his detention. In this case, several key issues were raised. The first issue was, did the Preventive Detention Act violate Article 14, 19, and 21 of the Constitution? The second issue was, what does procedure established by law mean in the context of preventive detention? Should it be interpreted as due process of law? The third issue was, did Gopalan's detention violate the principles of natural justice, as he was not informed of the reasons for his detention or given an opportunity to contest it? The Indian Supreme Court, in its ruling, analyzed the arguments presented by Gopalan's counsel and the state of Madras. The court arrived at several key conclusions. The first conclusion was related to the interpretation of Article 14, which is equality before law. The court upheld the constitutionality of the Preventive Detention Act, finding that the law was not discriminatory. It applied equally to all the individuals detained under it, and therefore it did not violate Article 14. The court emphasized that the Act was designed to protect the national security and public order. The second interpretation was related to Article 19, which gives freedom of speech and expression. Gopalan argued that his detention infringed upon the right of freedom of expression, and which was protected under Article 19. However, the court ruled that Article 19 always allows for reasonable restrictions on freedom and the interest of the national security and public order, thus justifying Gopalan's detention. The fourth was related to the interpretation of Article 21, which is right to life and personal liberty. The most significant aspect of the case was the interpretation of Article 21, which protects an individual's right to life and personal liberty. Gopalan contended that the phrase procedure established by law in Article 21 required a fair trial and due process. However, the court ruled that the phrase did not imply due process but simply required the detention to follow a valid law. Since the Preventive Detention Act was passed by the legislature, the court held that Gopalan's detention was lawful and did not violate his rights under Article 21. The fourth was related to natural justice. The court held that the principles of natural justice did not apply to preventive detention cases, since the Preventive Detention Act did not mandate the authorities to inform the detainees of reasons for his detention or offer him a hearing. The court concluded that there was no violation of natural justice in Gopalan's case. This case is highly significant in shaping the interpretation of the Indian Constitution, particularly Article 21. The ruling laid down that the procedure established by law under Article 21 does not necessarily require due process as understood in the American legal system. The court's interpretation meant that the laws passed by the legislature, even if they did not guarantee a trial or hearing, could still satisfy the requirements of Article 21. Additionally, the court's reasoning emphasized that the laws related to national security and public order could justifiably restrict the individual rights. The court justified preventive detention laws as necessary tools for protecting the country's security, even if they limit the right to personal liberty. The case also underscores the tension between national security concerns and the individual rights, which continues to be a recurring theme in the constitutional jurisprudence. Although the court upheld the law, it did not engage deeply with the broader constitutional challenge regarding whether preventive detention laws should be subject to greater scrutiny or whether the scope of Article 21 should be broadened. In an earlier case of Newspaper Express Private Limited versus Union of India, the court had held that an order passed by the government without providing an opportunity for a natural hearing violated the principles of natural justice. The A.K. Gopalan versus State of Madras case was significant because it clarified that in the context of preventive detention laws, the principles of natural justice was not always applicable, as Preventive Detention Act did not require the authorities to inform the detainees of the reasons for their detention or give an opportunity for a hearing. The A.K. Gopalan versus State of Madras case remains a cornerstone in the Indian constitutional law. It was one of the first cases where the Supreme Court interpreted the scope of Article 14, 19 and 21 of the Constitution. The judgment set a precedent for the interpretation of preventive detention laws and clarified that the Indian Constitution's protections for personal liberty could be limited by laws passed by the legislature, even if they did not guarantee a trial or hearing. Furthermore, the case marked an important moment in development of Article 21 jurisprudence. While the decision did not incorporate the due process standards as understood in other common law jurisdictions, it laid the groundwork for later cases such as Menka Gandhi versus Union of India, which expanded the interpretation of Article 21 to include the right to fair procedure. The A.K. Gopalan versus State of Madras case was pivotal in shaping the course of Indian constitutional law concerning preventive detention. The Supreme Court's interpretation of Article 21 set a precedent for future cases, although it remained a contested area of law. While the judgment upheld the Preventive Detention Act, it also opened the door for future developments in human rights and personal liberty jurisprudence. The case also became a reference point for discussions on national security versus individual freedoms and continues to be a critical part of constitutional law studies in India. Hi, I am Vishwajit and you are watching Landmark Cases.